Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So, we've been walking through an overview of the book of Revelation, and today I just wanted to take a few steps forward in that as we're going through. And we talked about the outline. We pretty much ended on this. Um, we've gone through and discussed the prologue. I do want to mention a little bit more about um, uh, really Revelation 1:19, where it talks about the things that are past, things present, and then eventually, as we go through the churches at the end, things to come or predictive. And the tribulation period really goes technically from chapter 6 through chapter 18. Chapter 19, the Lord returns. But in chapter 4 and 5, the church is in heaven, and then we end up um, seeing the seals being poured out. But right now, um, what we're going to do is take a brief look at the kind of overall here. This is really how the book is laid out. It's interesting. It's similar to the book of Acts when Luke wrote the book of Acts. He laid out what Jesus said in Acts 1:8. Um, Wait in the upper room for the Holy Spirit to come upon you. When he does, he'll make you witnesses of me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And that really is how the book is laid out. You start off in Jerusalem, it extends to Judea, Samaria, and then finally the uttermost parts of the earth with the Apostle Paul. So here um, in chapter 1, verse 19, now let's see um, if we look at uh, eSword here, we can see where um, in verse 19, Jesus tells John, write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. After this is the Greek word uh, metatauta, and that really refers to after. So here we have write the things which you have seen, which would be the vision in chapter 1 of Jesus, and then the things which are, which really represents chapters 2 and 3, the church age and the letters referencing those seven churches. And then finally, the things which will take place after this. That's the metatauta. If you have a Bible program, or if you um, have something that will show a concordance, you can look up the word after this and see how many times it occurs in the book of Revelation. But the main times is uh, the main places are really related to um, the break between these sections that I'm showing you, the vision, the things which you've seen, the things which are the church age, and finally the things after. Um, because in chapter 4 and 5, the church is in heaven, and then judgment comes, and then obviously the things that come after is not just the tribulation period, but Jesus returns in Revelation 19, sets up the kingdom in chapter 20, reigns for 1,000 years. The New Jerusalem is in 21, and then finally off into eternity in chapter 22. Really is a complete and chronological book. So uh, we've kind of moved into the church's section, chapter 2 and 3. And so I want to just take as opposed to going in depth into each church and reading through and doing a verse by verse commentary, I do want to keep this as a relative overview, but we will pick out some things that'll make it helpful. So there's three aspects of the seven churches that we want to look at. First, there's the local aspect. I mean, each church in the first century had a local and applicable message from Jesus, and that should be not Jesus Christ. So let me pause and correct that. Sorry about that. There we go. Anyways, um, uh, Jesus actually had John write these letters he talked about in chapter 1. So these letters are from Jesus Christ to them through, now, angel is anglos, it just means a messenger. Certainly can be an angel, one from heaven that we would understand as an angel, but in these letters, the context appears to really emphasize that the messenger is the pastor, that God is speaking to these congregations through the pastor. But there is an obvious, there's a local message. I mean, there are actual churches that received a letter, and these letters had information applicable to each one. Secondly, there's a contemporary aspect to it. Each church message is applicable to all or most churches today. In other words, there are um, churches dealing with the same subject matter that these letters address. So not everything in every letter is addressed to every church because it's not applicable to every church, but there are aspects of each that, in other words, as we go through these letters, as we would read through them, the thing that we want to do is say, how is that applicable, um, you know, to the church that I go to or to me personally? And so there's a contemporary aspect to it, obviously, and then finally a prophetic aspect, which is very interesting because um, that would not have really been a perspective seen probably in the first century because as they were writing, they had no idea how long it would be before Jesus returned. So the messages, when you look back, match church history, um, and in actually in a very high overview, but the sequence and the accuracy of it is really pretty stunning. So we'll take a look at all those. And so the prophetic view first, uh, Ephesus was really the apostolic church from AD 33 to 100. Um, John being the last apostle that died close to 100 AD, that is. And I think that, um, the apostolic church was certainly one that knew who were and were not apostles. We'll see in the message, but it really kind of falls into the main emphasis and the issues and everything else dealt with within that time frame really is represented by the Church of Ephesus. And as you read through the book, you can see that. Secondly, Smyrna. Um, the church was heavily persecuted under Rome from about 100 to 314 um, because the Edict of Toleration or the Edict of Milan that was given by Constantine actually in 313, um, that all of a sudden made it essentially against the law to persecute Christians. So, um, by 314, everything was settled down, but the um, the time in between, um, basically for those 200 years, you can read Fox's Book of Martyrs. There's Eusebius Church History. There's other books that talk about what happened during that time. And what's interesting is that there was probably, it's an estimated 3 to 6 million Christians were killed by Rome during that time period, and yet the church just kept growing. Persecution seemed to make the church thrive more than anything else. So that is kind of an interesting look because as you look back over history where the church was not persecuted, the growth was not the same, interestingly enough. But anyways, the Church of Smyrna was a persecuted church and does seem to represent that period of history as you look at it prophetically. Pergamos, which is really a paganized church. Now, that really represents what happened mostly in Rome from 314 to 590. Interestingly enough, 590 was the technically the first pope, Pope Gregory, though they had other people in the kind of ruling place in the church over those few hundred years. The paganism within the church was palpable, even though the church was not supposed to um, be pagan. The problem is that overnight, in a sense, pagan temples went away, and they could only be remade into Christian churches, and people just weren't necessarily converted, but they did want to go to church, and so there was a real mixture of a lot of the ancient Babylonian um, exercises of religion that had been there and developed since Nimrod at the Tower of Babel. And that was kind of um, really deeply embedded into the Roman culture and really the culture around where the Roman Empire took over. So that's really what um, ended up developing aspects of the Church of Rome. Now, if you want a lot of information on it and you're interested in reading, you can pick up a book by Alexander Heslop called Two Babylons. That would give you a lot of background on that historically, but that's um, that's if you're interested in digging in on that. The next one is Thyatira, which is really the development of the Roman Church to the present time. Um, the Roman Catholic Church, like I say, technically really started off in 590 with Pope Gregory and has really, it was solidified into the Church of Rome and exists to the present day. So it's interesting. Um, we'll see at the bottom of this screen what that actually shows us with some of the other churches. But you see the Roman Church in Thyatira and the challenge to them that's mentioned. But at the end, it talks about really, um, you know, Jesus gives them a warning that he's coming, right? Same thing with Sardis, which um, unfortunately became a dead church. It was had a um, reputation that it was alive. Jesus says, but it was dead. And unfortunately, out of the Reformation, some of the denominations have really turned into dead orthodoxy, um, and it is like that even to the present time. Not all of them, but a good percentage of the denominations represented from the Reformation period have really deteriorated, and they still exist today. We have Philadelphia, which is really the revived church in 1800, um, began a lot of churches, a big missionary movement, um, but there was a whole move back to um, Bible teaching in a new way. So it's interesting. Historically, you look at what the church did in the 1800s and the um, the method of Bible study, even in our own country here. The Plymouth Brethren came over and they had a way of teaching verse by verse through the Bible. It was picked up by the um, uh, the Bible Church movement, which it's called. So you have a lot of Bible churches, and they pretty much teach through the Bible. Calvary, Calvary Chapel really picked up that same method of Bible teaching, and that's really been the only thing that has enabled the church to flourish is when it teaches through the Bible. There's nothing wrong with topical sermons, but topical sermons are something that should be in addition to verse by verse teaching. The problem with um, not teaching the Bible verse by verse, book by book, cover to cover, is that the people don't actually learn the Bible. They learn the topics. They learn different subjects. They learn the pastor's pet peeves. They learn a lot of things, but what they don't learn is the actual Bible. They learn things from the Bible. They learn things that are compared to the Bible or correlate to the Bible, but they don't learn the Bible. And what that does is that removes their ability to have the working knowledge of the Word and the ability to discern whether the pastor is actually telling them the truth. In other words, they're not given enough education to properly analyze what they're being told. And but that church goes to the present time, good, you know, thriving Bible teaching church. But again, the message to Philadelphia is like that's what they have. You know, they've kept the word. Laodicea uh, is called the Relaxed Church. Again, 1800s to the present, and that's really a church that is mixed with the world in such a way that they have taken on worldly standards. And there's always going to be churches and church movements that really take on what is in the culture. They try to bring it into the church. They try to um, take the principles in the culture, uh, like like presently, a lot of churches have become entertainment centers where it's a light and sound show. It's smoke and unfortunately mostly smoke and mirrors, but um, and people enjoy the entertainment, and so the draw for people is the entertainment. The problem is that the draw should be Jesus. We should be coming, whether a church is singing with, you know, um, one musician singing on a guitar, or you get a whole full worship team, or even if you have, choir, whatever you got, the focus should be Jesus. Um, without without so many distractions that you have to navigate your way through it to actually just get to Jesus. And unfortunately, a lot of the worship today is very self-centered. It's me-centered. Uh, Jesus, I like how you make me feel. Um, I like what you do for me. It's really kind of, again, it's part of the culture. The culture is focused on me. So when I bring that whole ideology into church. And I say, well, I want it to be the same because that's what I'm used to out in the culture. Then the problem is the church is starting to submerge into the culture. You can't tell the difference. Um, the church is supposed to be the pillar and ground of the truth. It's the only place where people are going to get the truth. And so the church's goal is to lift people out of the culture. We have a revelation. We have a different message. We don't have um, kind of um, a culturally sensitive message where we're just competing with some of the entertainment industry or celebrities or whatever to try to get people's attention, like about a social media account here or there or something that's attracting. Um, the attraction is Jesus, who he is, what he's done. This is what John saw in chapter 1. It's focused on Christ. This whole book, the book of Revelation, is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And the problem is the Laodicean church, they thought that they were, uh, you know, in need of nothing because of their wealth, because again, they made their comparisons with the world. But unfortunately, as Jesus says, they were um, miserable, wretched, poor, blind, and naked. Not a good message to hear. So notice the last four churches have reference to being ready for the Lord's return, the rapture, because they actually go to the present. And all this really fits nicely as you look back into a prophetic view of the church. So we wanted to add that in as a means of looking at it. Now, this chart, excuse me, really breaks down the churches um, and the things that are. And notice that in, you know, across the top, um, you have a description of Christ for each church. You have a complement, which only Laodicea does not have. You have a criticism, which both Smyrna, the suffering church, and the church that's grounded in the Word, um, Philadelphia, there is no criticism to them. There's a correction for each. There's a consequence for each except for Smyrna. Smyrna had no consequence because they were just looking at martyrdom. There's a promise to each, and then, like we talked about, um, the prophetic aspect, how it really aligns in church history. Um, so this is a good chart for that. I do like how it's laid out, and notice in Ephesus. You know, they, Jesus he identifies himself as the one that holds the seven stars and walks in the midst. Well, he compliments them, right? On their works, labor, patience. They can't bear uh, or false apostles or evil people. They hate the Nicolaitans, the ones that developed a priesthood. Um, Nicolaitan means to conquer over the laity. The criticism is that they left their first love. They didn't lose it; they left it, and so he says to correct things, you got to remember where you've fallen, repent, and repeat the first works, right? Go back, remember, repent, and repeat. Get back to that place where um, there's a love relationship, and that can be applicable to a church or to an individual. That's what's so great about these messages. Um, the consequence is that if they don't, then he'll remove them basically from his presence because uh, Jesus isn't going to hang around a church where he's not wanted. It's really kind of that simple. Um, the promise, right? They'll eat of the tree of life. In other words, they'll be partaking of Christ himself, and then it's the apostolic church. So, you can pause this, you can look through this, you can, take a screenshot of it or a picture of it or whatever. I just think it's really helpful um, as kind of as an overview. Um, and I I think some of the churches are heavily criticized, and but yet when you look at it from a church history standpoint, um, it is important that we take those things to account because each of these can each of these churches can have a message that's applicable in some way to our present churches today in America or in the world, really, or really even to individual people. So, um, really kind of hits the whole um, kind of the A to Z within Christianity for what we have to deal with. Now, in chapter 4 and 5, the church is in heaven, right? And then obviously God's program is laid out for the rest of the book, beginning in chapter 4. As a matter of fact, if we go to Esword and we take a look at chapter 4, verse 1, let me just get there. Notice after these things, right? Metatauta, right? Um, in these first two verses, it says, John says, after these things, I looked and behold a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, come up here, and I'll show you things which much must take place after this, metatauta. Um, Immediately I was in the spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. Now, if we look at the King James Plus of this, now notice after this. though you can't see it, this Greek word is after is meta, and then this is tauta, and then here at um, the end of the verse, again it's meta, and then tauta with the Greek words. I wonder if let me see if I double click on this. If um, so, notice here. So here's the meta, right? Um, the uh, G3226, and then if I double click on the uh, G5023, and then bring the Strong's Concordance out, there's your Tauta. So, and a lot of occurrences. Now, one of the things we can do is we can look in this King James commentary, I'm sorry, concordance, and um, if you can look, um, let's see, hereafter, how it's translated in the Old King James. You got um, chapter 119, right? Chapter 4, verse 1. Here, you also have um, chapter 9, but this is related to the woes that are coming. But those, again, are the two key places to uh, break it up. So back to New King James. Anyways, so here, in these two verses, um, it says, he looked, and there was a door open in heaven. And then the first voice, which he heard, like a trumpet, right, saying, come up here. And then it says, immediately I was in the spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. This reminds me of the rapture because, you know, um, it's immediate, right? Um, the rapture is obviously going to be in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. It's immediate. Um, there was a voice like a trumpet speaking. It says in First Thessalonians chapter 4 that the Lord will descend from heaven with a voice, with the shout um, of the archangel and the trump of God, and the dead in Christ are raised first. Right. This will happen. 1 Corinthians 15:51 and 52. It says at the last trump. That's not the trumpet judgment of the last trumpet in the book of Revelation. Those are related to judgment, but we've gone through that before. But anyways, I thought that was interesting, so I wanted to point that out. And so heading back here, we have the program laid out, right? The church is not mentioned after chapter 3. It's just chapter 2 and 3 where churches is mentioned. And again, um, after chapter 3, it'll say, you know, let he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Prior to chapter 4, it says, let he who has an ear to hear what the Spirit is speaking to the churches. So um, there's an obvious difference. Now, the church is mentioned 19 times in the first 3 chapters. Not once in chapter 6 to 19 really is technically the tribulation period through 18. The church is in heaven and praises God in chapter 4. Revelation 4:1, after these things, right? Twice Metakatauta, we just looked at that. Now, when John is in heaven, he sees 24 elders. Now, these 24 elders, I believe, represent the church. They have crowns. There are two words for crowns in the New Testament. The one is Stephanos, that's a victor's crown. The other one is diadem, which is um, the crown of a ruler or somebody that has authority. So these are um, victor's crowns. The church in heaven praises God for his redemption. And in Revelation 5, 9, and 10, there's a song of redemption. Now, um, I don't want to get too geeky on this, but, you know, it says, you have redeemed us. right? Um, Now, 23 out of the 24 New Testament manuscripts that have the book of Revelation in it translate the word us, not them. So it's interesting that um, other than the King James and New King James, all the other Bibles translated them. And, we're trying to adhere to the text of the manuscripts that exist. So, because if it says us, then it is the church, because the church is not broken up. It's not just some representative group that's separated or whatever. It either is or is not the church. Now, this is a note from Cease. He says some critics and expositors have rejected us for the reason that it is omitted in the Codex Alexandrinus and in the Ethi, Ethiop, yeah, easy for me to say, Ethiopic version. In other words, um, there's one codex from Alexandria that the word us is not in, so they've removed it out. Um, it's part of the critical text, and I've done videos on New Testament manuscripts if you want to view those. But anyways, it says, though the latter is not much more than a loose paraphrase, that's the Ethiopic version. Uh, the Codex Sinaiticus, however, which was discovered in 1860 and which is of equal antiquity and authority with Codex Alexandrinus, contains it. The Codex Basilianus in the Vatican contains it. The Latin Coptic or Memphitic and Armenian, which are of great value, contain it, and so do all other manuscripts and versions. And to discredit it simply and only because it does not appear in that one single codex of Alexandrina is most unreasonable and unjust to the weight of authority for its retention. Dr. Trugelis, on full examination, was firmly convinced of its right uh, to a place in the text before the Codex Sinaiticus appeared. He was the one that actually discovered Sinaiticus. And the presence of this us in the manuscript ought to settle the question of its genuineness forever. The evidences from the context also argue powerfully for a construction which necessarily embraces it, whether expressed or not. We regard it as indubitably genuine. A little trouble today. But, anyways, um, all that to say that the manuscripts support um, us in the text, which tells us, no pun intended, that it is the church in heaven. So if we look in chapter 5, um, talks about the 24 elders falling down before the Lamb in verse 8. In 9, it says, and they sang a new song saying, you are worthy, right? So if we look at the King James, thou art worthy to take the book, open the seals, for you were slain, has redeemed uh, us to God by thy blood out of every kindred, tribe, tongue, and nation, right? And has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. So um, that is I think, the best translation. And if it is saying us, it has to be the identification of a group unique for the us to be there. So that's where we get that. Now, um, why the church isn't in the tribulation period? Um, in chapter 6 to 18, the 7 year tribulation, or Daniel's 70th week, is related to God's dealing with Israel prophetically to bring them to faith in Jesus of Nazareth as their Messiah, right? Matthew 23:39, Jesus said, you won't see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It is identified as Daniel's specific 7 year period for Israel. Um, it's broken in half. Now, it's broken in half into two periods of a time, which is a year, times and a half a time. So it's mentioned in these verses in Daniel and then in Revelation. If you miss it in years, you get it in months, 42 months, 3.5 years, Revelation 11:2 and 13:5. If you miss it in months, you get it in days, right? 1,260 days, again in Revelation and Daniel. So um, Daniel extends it to 1,290 days, adding time to judge and set up the millennial kingdom. That's in Daniel 11. So a time is 1 year, times is 2 years, half time is half a year, obviously. So that's 3.5 years. And if you miss the time designation in years, you get it in months and days. So um, I think, we've talked about this a bit, but this is important because going forward, these these designations for time match between Daniel and the book of Revelation. They really are best studied in parallel. And then the abomination of desolation is the midpoint, and that connects Daniel's prophecy with Jesus' teaching on the tribulation period. So that's really how the book is kind of laid out as for overall times for that 7 years. That 7 years begins in chapter 6, which we'll get to, and then it goes through chapter 18. Number four, the 7 year period, the second 3.5 years in particular, is the worst uh, time the world will ever see. This is mentioned in a number of places, obviously Jeremiah, Joel, Daniel, and Matthew. There can only be one of these times. You can't have more than one worst. I mean, you have the worst, that's the worst. The church is not mentioned again after Revelation 3. In chapter 5, verse 9, it has all the church singing in heaven, which is the us. 6 to 18 is the pouring out of God's wrath from heaven, which the church is delivered from. We learn that in Romans 5:9, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, and Revelation 3:10 with the church of Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, we'll take a quick look at that. And so, First Thessalonians, um, I'm sorry, Revelation chapter 3. And the church of Philadelphia, um, he says, because you have, yeah, we'll go back to New King James a little easier. Uh, because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I will also keep you from the hour trial, which is coming upon the whole world, right, to test those who dwell on the earth. So this is a global issue. This is not, this has to be global. It can't be local to just one local church in Asia Minor. They all would have been dealing with it if it's a global issue. So um, this in particular obviously has a prophetic element to it. And if we look at it in the King James, um, and we see, you've kept the word of my patience, I also will keep you from. So this is the little Greek word ek. Um, and so um, notice here it says sprout from, and then out, place, cause, time, literally, figuratively denote, right? So the idea is um, it is out of that time period. So that's why it is a promise to the Church of Philadelphia in 3:10. So then in chapter 7, it reveals Jews and Gentiles as separate salvation groups. The church has no ethnic distinction, right? Uh, Everybody's the same in the church. Doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. But here, notice in Revelation chapter 7, it's divided. Jews are divided from Gentiles, and are uniquely sealed, different than the Gentiles. So um, that that is the opposite of what would happen in the church, which is why the church really is not represented there. The 24 elders in Revelation 4 are representatives of the church. They're not angels, because in chapter 7, verse 11, we see the angels differentiated from the elders and living creatures standing around the elders, and they are standing, not seated. Um, so the angels, they can't be the tribulation saints, because in 7:13 the elders ask who they are and where they came from, and they are a multitude no man can number. 24 elders actually have a number. They're not Israel. They were preserved through the tribulation and listed in chapter 7. The Old Testament saints are raised at the start of the 1,000-year reign in chapter 20. The number 24 is never associated with angels. In First Chronicles 24, David set up 24 shifts of priests to serve. These were representative of the nation. The church is a priesthood. The Old Testament priesthood is no longer functional, so the only one left is the New Testament priesthood, which is the church. The first term, elders, presbyteros, used is always used of men in Scripture. It's not used of angels. So in Revelation 3:21, Laodicea, the overcomers are promised to sit on thrones. Angels have no thrones. In Revelation 3, 5, and 18, Sardis and Laodicea, overcomers, are promised white robes. In Revelation 2, 10 and 3:11, Smyrna and Philadelphia, the overcomers are promised victor's crowns, Stephanos, like we saw. When heaven is seen by Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Zechariah, the heavenly scenes don't have the elders. They're only there after the church is established. The church is a mystery hidden from the beginning of the world. Talks about that. Paul does in Ephesians 3:9. That only now it might be known. John now seeing them represented in heaven. So the next slide will map out the differences between the rapture and the second coming. This again is a good overview. I think that, again, if you want to take a screenshot, take a picture with your phone, do whatever. We don't have to belabor each of these, um, but this tells you that the rapture is not the second coming. Post tribulation, it's we'll try to combine the two. Um, that doesn't really work. We've talked about that earlier, a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the rapture. And then here is the overall layout chronologically in the book. And one thing I want to make a note of here is that um, some Bible commentators see the halfway point of the tribulation not during the trumpets, but they see it kind of pushed ahead so that it's in between the sixth and seventh, uh, or the fifth and sixth seal, because they have martyrs. I think the other way. I think it's more accurate this way, but whether it's this way or that way, whether you move it ahead, um, it's your choice. There's good commentators on both sides of the issue. So some just view the timing of the seals and trumpets a little differently. This is from Dr. Andy Woods and his PowerPoint presentation. He has the trumpets and just the bowls really in the latter half. Uh, and again, I think that's pretty much what we're seeing back in the in this slide here. It's not like the middle actually comes in the middle of the trumpets. It's just the middle comes right around the end of the trumpets, which is really what Andy is representing here. And so next time we will go forward with chapter 6. Hopefully, this is instructive enough as a good outline and overview, um, though we don't have the detailed verse by verse discussion on it at this point. Um, so until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.